Welcome to Global Insights podcast. And today we are in Cambridge, and very glad to welcome Professor Robert Thoms from University of Cambridge, St. John's College. Welcome.
Very pleased to be here to talk to you.
And accompanying me, Dr. Daniel Staetsky, also from the Cambridge University. We would like to talk about one very interesting woman, which has now became potentially the future leader of the Great Britain. Yeah, and her name is Kemi Badenoch, Conservative Party of United Kingdom. Why we see in the recent years more and more, I would say, interesting persons who became the leaders of the party. And for example, on the other side, we don't see such people coming to the power.
Yes, that's true. I think the simplest answer would be that the Conservative Party, which, as you probably know, is a very old party in its origin, it goes back to the early 18th century, is essentially about winning power and about governing. And it will do whatever it needs to do and choose whoever it needs to choose in order to do that. Of course, it's called a Conservative Party now because its aim is essentially to defend the national interest and the interests of many people within the country against what it tends to see as ideological attacks or anything that causes undesirable changes. And the fact that Kemi Badenoch is in origin Nigerian is of no great importance to a party which, above all, wants to get back into office. And if she can help it back into office, then they'll be very happy. So the Conservative Party was, until quite recently, pretty racist, as all political parties in Britain were. I mean, in the 1950s, it would have been unthinkable then for a black woman to be leader of the party. Now it's perfectly normal. The party changes, and its idea of what conservatism means also changes.
I was listening for a few conversations which Kemi Badenoch had on Sky News, for example, where she's saying generally simple things, for example, regarding the Israel, the Middle East crisis, the war with the terror, Hamas. And she's saying simple things, I wouldn't say that I could heard something extraordinary. So saying this is the terrorist, this is the good, this is the bad, if I'm putting things simple. And in this current reality, these simple things, which was should be obvious to everyone. They already, when you hear them, it's kind of strange. Wow, yeah, we know it's that simple, but no one is telling that.
Yes, that's true. We live in a very strange cultural atmosphere at the moment, very much influenced by American political culture, in which the values that most people took for granted are in a state of flux. And therefore to say simple things has become very controversial and really quite brave. And I think the thing that attracted people to Kemi Badenoch is that she appears to be willing to say what she thinks and to say what other people think in a way that is now seen as unusually courageous and unusually frank, in the sense that politicians, perhaps politicians throughout history, but politicians certainly, I would say, since the Blair era, have aimed at pleasing the centre ground and avoiding controversial issues. And so it's become a kind of conventional wisdom that you win power by being moderate. Kemi has become leader of the party because many of its members are really tired of what they see as a failed centrism. And they want someone who will articulate a much clearer and stronger idea of conservatism, which I think does mean for her and for most party members, of which I'm not one, it means defending the national interest against all sorts of things, including against mass immigration. against woke culture, against things like rather extreme transgenderism, all the things that have been creating a kind of upheaval for many people in what they thought they believed. And so Kemi stands for what I think most people would see as common sense. In some ways, she's inevitably compared with Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Party's first woman leader, and who remains really, I suppose, for most Conservatives, their heroic figure.
Yeah, the icon.
Yes, and she too was an outsider. She too was chosen because she seemed to articulate common sense. And I think, one could say that conservatism in Britain is not an ideology, as it is in many countries. It's not associated with particular views of society or religion or culture even. It tends to be seen by those who support it as standing for common sense. Therefore, in some ways, it's not a party of the right in the way that parties in many other European countries have a clear ideological history. Conservatism is constantly changing, and I suppose I would say that, if you were to define it in its own eyes, it is that it stands for common sense, realism, practicality, and tends to resist what it sees as ideological extremism. So someone who can speak for, who can re-articulate that kind of conservatism is likely to be popular, whether man or woman, whether white or black or whatever.
Very good example is Kemi Badenoch here in the United Kingdom. She came, actually she's a new immigrant. You can say she's an immigrant. She formally has the British citizenship by her birth, but she came to the country at age 16.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the same age I came to Israel. So she was raised in other environment, but what I'm thinking is, like, I was born in Soviet Union and my friend Daniel as well. But when we came to other countries and we moved to other places, it doesn't mean we want to impose communism, because we know that communism is not such a good idea. So what I'm thinking is that people coming to the United Kingdom, they're coming because their life in their original countries was miserable and bad. And they know it's a bad system. So probably it can be a shift and they can support the more conservative, the more... to be more patriotic to the United Kingdom.
Yes. Well, I think that's true. I think she has said things like that, that she knows what it was like to be brought up in Nigeria, and that she's willing to defend what she sees as British values and British successes. Well, that's something that, again, a few years ago would have seemed very commonplace. But as you probably know, we've been living through a remarkable period of cultural lack of self-confidence, in which it's become seen as part of the progressive view of the world to regard your own country. This is true not only of Britain, but certainly of the Anglosphere countries, to regard your history as being something to be ashamed of. Colonialist, racist, exploitative, and so on. And therefore, many people who regard themselves as progressive would certainly not be willing to say the sort of things that Kemi Badenoch says. And as you say, she's able to say these things because she comes originally from the outside. So she's both very integrated into British society, evidently, as a member of Parliament and so on, but still has the view of someone who approaches it from elsewhere. And I think that is a strength. It's one of the things I thought was a strength in her position. And the conservative philosopher, there aren't all that many of them, Roger Scruton, who unfortunately died a few years ago, wrote about the importance of home as the core of conservatism. It's about the idea of your country being your home. And he said that people who come from elsewhere can decide to make it their home, and often come to see it in a very special way as the place in which they, as you say, find refuge, find a place that they can identify with. You, I guess, did precisely that in Israel. And it seems to me that Kemi Badenoch has done it here. And that's one of the things that I think gives her a very strong position to lead the party. A party which has, in recent years, been extremely divided, and which does represent a very broad collection of interests and sentiments. And I think, to put it in very simple terms, Brexit showed that the Conservative Party represents at least two major tendencies, major views of what is rational. One is to see the Conservative Party as the party of business. And as most of business wanted us to stay in the EU, then many Conservatives thought staying in the EU is what they should do. Then there's another tradition which is, let's say, a nationalistic or a patriotic tradition that sees things like national independence, national sovereignty, accountability to the national government as being more important. And those were the Brexiteers within the party. I suppose anyone who wants to lead the party, like Kemi Badenoch, has got to bring those two sides together. And I think when she was Trade Minister, she was the only minister, as far as I could see, who was making a real effort to do that by using her position to say that, Brexit can be made a success because we can sign trade agreements with many other countries now, the most important being with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And therefore, we can go beyond this debate about whether Brexit was good or bad, and we can say, well, there are opportunities that we are now going to take and which will be successful. She said that. Very few Conservative ministers said that for reasons that I find very difficult to understand. And I think that's a major part of why they were so badly defeated in the last election. After all, Brexit was their major historic achievement. If you're not willing to defend your great achievement and say it was good, then you're not going to be very appealing to the electorate. And I think the previous Conservative governments, particularly of Sunak, who of course was also of non-British stock, and of Theresa May, who was very British or English, were not willing to take a strong position and say that Brexit was good, Brexit was right, and we intend to make it work. They were always rather apologetic about it, as if they hoped that people would forget it had ever happened. And I think that was a disaster.
So you think these simple messages which Kemi Badenoch is actually giving, very simple ones, like what I said, is just going to the basics, the good and the bad. And I saw just her talking about the Israel. That was a good example how she explains why Israel is right. In very simple words, we miss it from, we talked with Daniel before we came here, we said in Israel we miss such people, speaking like that. So she's explaining it even better, because even in Israel many people are confused.
Yes. Well, she's a very intelligent person, and she's someone who is willing to say what she thinks and is willing to be unpopular with certain parts of the country. It's something of a gamble, because most of the elite, if I can use a populist term, have really bought into this progressive ideology which we call woke. I don't know whether you use that term in Israel, but it's a whole set of ideas about the world which includes things like strong anti-racism. The whole world is racist, and hence anti-racism is what you must do. Israel, therefore, is attacked as a racist country. Anti-colonialist, to have a very caricatural view of settlement, of empire, which did both good things and bad things. That's another very simple and obvious thing to say. But to regard colonialism as being wholly wicked, and therefore, again, both Britain and Israel are seen as colonial countries. All these things which have become part of a kind of a very homogeneous view of the world, and which most people don't accept, but which a lot of very influential people do accept, especially younger people, academics, university students, journalists, people in the media, rock stars, those people all buy into this. So Kemi says no. Kemi is willing to say that she doesn't accept this in a way that other conservative politicians would be afraid to do.
I'm just wondering, like, US, we're currently in 21st century, a lot of means to get information.
Yes.
You know, like, I'm not saying that colonialism was the ideal way of running the world, but let's say this way, it's clear now that when the United Kingdom abandoned Africa, currently it's ended in the disaster. Yeah, so it's like not ending catastrophe which is going on in Africa. And I don't know if the British rule was ideal, but in many places in Africa, I'm speaking with people and they like dream of coming back to the under the umbrella of the British Empire. Okay, after all, if you go to places like Zimbabwe, you know, like people are starving there, people are dead, are dying there. And before that, they had non-ideal society, but maybe it should be changed and gradually changed. But they had the British court in place, you know, they had the government systems, the medicine, and now they have nothing. I mean, if this is justice,
yeah,
I don't know. So why these simple things are not clear, I mean, to the general public in the United Kingdom? But they don't know that there is disaster in Zimbabwe.
Well, many people do. I mean, they're not very interested, I think. So they believe, if they're told that colonialism was terrible and wicked and is responsible for every ill, then many people believe it. And especially they're afraid to contradict it because they don't really know. And because contradicting it, you know, if people were to say what you just said and to say, well, actually British rule in Zimbabwe was better than independent rule has been, many people would say, well, that's just racist. And they would probably say, oh, well, yes, but all the problems that Zimbabwe has must have been caused by colonialism. So it's a kind of circular argument, which is based on no real understanding or evidence, but simply the acceptance of what has become a dominant way of looking at the world.
But for example, I don't know, in Israel we also had a mandate of
yes.
United Kingdom, and I don't know, we don't see such a bad effect of colonialism. I mean, we have still our court system is working
yes.
according to British rules. I mean, it can be sustainable once you preserve the good things which is, came from the United Kingdom.
Well, some have been preserved and some have not. I mean, the British Empire was a pretty fragile thing. It was often run by a very tiny number of people. In fact, I had a couple of letters recently from two quite elderly ladies, both of whom had their parents or grandparents who'd been colonial officials. And one of them said to me that when her I think it was her father or her grandfather had been sent out to East Africa at the age of 23. He'd had to walk 100 miles, build his own headquarters out of wood and straw. And then he was supposed to be governing an area half the size of Scotland with 200,000 warring tribes. Well, you could only do that if the people wanted you to do it. Once they stopped wanting you to do it, there was no way you could do it. And in any case, Britain did not have, after the Second World War, either the will or the finances to want to continue
the means
that.
to keep the empire.
Yeah, so I think nobody really wanted to keep it. And unlike Putin, who wants to keep his empire, I don't think people in Britain wanted to keep the empire and hoped that you could turn it into a commonwealth of democratic nation states. Well, in some cases that worked, in some cases not. But it's not something that I think Britain ever had really the power to determine. And I've often written, though nobody believes it, that we hugely exaggerate the power that Britain had at the height of its empire. It was really quite a weak empire, run on very small resources. And people think Britain was a superpower. Well, it never was. It's always been a medium-sized country, which at one time had a very large empire. But that empire was something that could only continue as long as there was very little resistance to it. But when you had nationalists and the Russians, the Soviets and the Americans who were trying to destroy it, there was no way that Britain could continue it.
Yeah, I think after the Second World War, the Great Britain was much weaker.
Yes,
Compared
it was
to
largely
the,
bankrupt.
Yeah, that's clear.
I'd like to go back to the beginning, if I may, and ask this question. We have in Britain two major political parties. Of course, Britain has more, but these are the major contestants in every election.
Yeah.
And some would say, and I would like to articulate that argument, that we see now a significant number of people from ethnic and racial and maybe religious minorities who rose to prominence in the Conservative Party. Then we look at the Labour Party, and you cannot quite come up with names as easily as you could come up with when we talk about the Conservatives. So Kemi Badenoch is just one example of that phenomenon, but there's also Rishi Sunak, obviously there's Priti Patel, Suella Braverman. Yes. It's very easy to come up with those names. Everyone who knows anything about politics knows these names. It looks to me that it's not as easy to do when you speak about the Labour Party, yet Labour Party for years presented itself as championing the minorities, particularly. So what happened there? You said in the beginning that Conservatives are rather pragmatic. They want to rule. The differences of race or culture don't particularly matter. And that's how we explain the rise of the minorities then. They're transparent in a way. They just have to be functional. Well, that didn't happen in the Labour part of the political spectrum. And what would be your explanation for that? We sort of expect it to happen there at least to the same degree, but we don't see it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd suggest two hypotheses. One would be that the Conservatives appeal to middle-class members of ethnic minorities, and therefore they're people who are much more likely to make a career in politics. Labour appeals to, let's say, the least advantaged groups within of ethnic minorities, and that those groups have not yet, might happen, produced people who are in a position to lead the party. I mean, that would be one. That would, let's say, be a pretty basic sociological explanation. I mean, another explanation, which would be more cynical, I suppose, would be that the Labour Party likes to see ethnic minorities as groups that it can patronise and that it can mobilise politically, but it doesn't really want them to be running the party. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it certainly looks like it. You know, the Labour Party has people who become quite well known. Dawn Butler at present, Diane Abbott in previous generations, but they were never given positions of real authority. They were there partly for symbolic reasons, I suppose. But it's interesting, as you say, that the party itself has never been willing to give positions of authority to members of ethnic minorities. The Labour Party is very much a bourgeois party now. It has hardly any working class MPs. If it had working class MPs, then you would expect some of those working class MPs to be from working class ethnic minorities. But they're not. And I guess that's the reason. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it's a very workable hypothesis. In the run-up, I think, to the elections in 2019, if I remember well, I saw a quotation from one of the leaders of the Labour Party, something in the style that only Labour Party can unlock the potential of Asian minorities, something in that style, which appeared very condescending to me, and that's how it was made public. That's a terrible statement to make at the time, and that was disseminated as a meme with a picture of Priti Patel next to it. So this is what the Labour says. That's whose potential they are unlocking.
Yeah.
In that, I think it's a question that needed to be answered, and you answered it very well.
Well, thank you. Of course, the Labour Party, and certainly the left generally, is, as you know, very hostile, viciously hostile towards members of ethnic minorities who are conservative. of whom Priti Patel is one, Suella Braverman another, and Kemi Badenoch the most recent. And your viewers may not know that she was really insulted in a very gross way by one of the ethnic minority Labour MPs, who said the phrase was something like she was white supremacy in blackface.
Yes. It was offensive almost to the extent where I thought maybe we shouldn't repeat it. But you said it, and I'm glad.
Well, it's been widely repeated, of course. Yeah. And nothing was done to this woman. She did not have the whip removed from her, which would be to expel her at least temporarily from the Labour Party. So this was accepted because the Labour Party does, or many of its militants do not accept that people from ethnic minorities should not be on their side. Yeah. And I think Kemi in particular, well, not the only one, because Suella and Priti have been in a similar position, because they've taken quite strongly conservative views on things like immigration and culture wars. They've been particularly detested by those on the left who are the partisans of those particular issues.
What do you think are the chances for her to take the power? I mean, currently we're speaking in the end of 2024, so it's quite a few years to the elections, probably. You never know, we never know, but probably. Yes. What do you think the chances are?
Well, I mean, obviously, so I won't go into this. A lot of it depends on her personality and her abilities. She's held office, but she hasn't been tested to this extent. Clearly, no one knows how she'll be able to do the job. But otherwise, I think the chances are quite good. Our politics, not only here, but in many Western countries, have become much more volatile than they were. You know, politics used to move with glacial speed. So you could say, well, you know, the Labour Party has a majority of whatever it is. It would take at least 2 elections before that could shift. But what I've noticed in recent years is that almost after every election, some prediction is made about the extinction of some party. So in 2019, it was the Labour Party that was said to be incapable of ever holding power again. You know, the Labour Party was dead. And then now it's the Conservative Party that's dead. People are much less attached to parties than they were a few generations ago, and this is true, I think, in every country. Parties don't have the grassroots organisation that they once had. In some ways, they're rather like brands, and I think people's loyalty changes very quickly. The problem for the Conservatives is reform. Let's say the anti-Brexit centrist predominance within the Conservative Party since they last came into office has really alienated a lot of their working class support, for whom immigration, jobs and economic development are the big issues. Boris Johnson seemed to be able to bring these people together. Indeed, he did in the 2019 elections. But then Boris proved to be a great disappointment for a number of reasons. COVID was one thing. The Ukrainian war and inflation was another thing. But nevertheless, they never were able to do some of the things they promised, which was essentially this phrase levelling up. So the Conservative Party in 2019 appeared to be a quite successful, if you like, populist party. I don't mind the word populist myself, which was able to bring together people of different classes, different regions, with somewhat different interests, but could offer them, in the name of national unity, national self-determination, leaving the EU, and promising to do something radical to help people who had been left behind. Well, it didn't do that, and it lost, quite rightly. I think it deserved to lose. Whether Labour deserved to win is another matter. I think probably they didn't, and we're seeing that now. So to get back to the question of Kemi Badenoch, I think because people's loyalties are very volatile, because I don't think reform probably has a long-term future, because our political system makes it very difficult for insurgent parties. That's why, as you say, the two major parties have dominated politics now for a century. It's very difficult in our system for new parties to come through. I don't think reform will do that. It won hardly any MPs. And so I think the Conservative Party will remain the main party of opposition. And the present government has so far proved to be so inept that you would expect a pretty rapid change of the political weather. Indeed, some opinion polls have shown that the Conservatives are already more popular than Labour. If Kemi can keep on building on that, keep the momentum going, and show that she is a different kind of politician, then I think the chances of her coming to power are good. Whether Labour will last out its full term is another matter. I mean, anything can happen. You know, Harold Macmillan, famous Conservative politician, was asked what the greatest difficulty he'd faced was, and he said events. Yes. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with China, we don't know what's going to happen with Russia and the Ukraine. The government is following an energy policy that seems to me completely lunatic, which may well start causing power cuts. I mean, I think any of those things could shorten the life of this government, and in that case, Kemi has to be ready to take over. Yeah.
Okay. There's an interesting underlying theme in the British politics since the 1945. If we have to define where our world begins, chronologically, 1945 is not a bad choice. No. And if we take all of these years, it's almost 80 years of history, and quantify the presence of the political parties, so simply slice that period into the Labour and Conservatives and quantify that, what we would see, I think you may know this very well, that the Conservatives ruled for about 2/3 of that period, and Labour for 1/3, and typically Labour periods was sort of short stunts, except one under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, which, ironically or not, both of them are sort of the right wing of the Labour Party. They're almost social democrats. So, if you wish, that tells you quite a lot about Britain as Britain. It looks almost, if we go to the level of caricature, that there's a Conservative Party, basically, and it rules, and from time to time, electorate throws a tantrum and says, okay, go and sit on the naughty step. They've done something. But that happens for 4 or 5 years, 6 years, sometimes longer, uniquely on one occasion, and then the Conservative Party comes back. So if that's the narrative, if that's the story, then we should be more optimistic about Kemi Badenoch. She's now in a good...
Well, I hope you're right, but there is another way of looking at it would be to say the Conservatives have been the party of government mainly for now, well, since the 1880s, certainly since the 1920s. So for a century, the Conservatives have mainly governed, and that's because the anti-Conservative forces have been divided. You know, if you think of the Conservatives in slightly, in simple terms, as those who represent the mainstream of English life. The Conservatives usually have a majority in England, but not in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. So the Conservatives represent those people in England who are fairly happy with the way things are. And as long as the others are divided between Labour, Liberal Democrats, Scottish Nationalists, Welsh Nationalists, etc., the Conservatives are likely to be in power, even if they don't win a majority of votes, which they never do. No one ever does. But now the Conservatives are divided between the Conservative Party and Reform, Nigel Farage's party, and Labour are more united than they have been, though they only won a quarter of the vote, as we know. If it was possible for Labour, in desperation, to form some sort of coalition or alliance with the Scottish Nationalists, the Welsh Nationalists, the Greens, then they might be able to defeat the Conservatives, especially if the Conservatives remain, let's say, the Conservatives with a small c, remain divided between the Conservative Party and Reform Party. That would be the thing that would keep Kemi out of power forever. And the other worrying thing, or at least it might be worrying, is that the Conservative Party tends to be older. Conservatives tend to be older. Younger people tend to vote for the other parties whichever they are. Now that seems to be unusually a British phenomenon for the time being, in that it doesn't seem to be the case in America or France or Germany or much of Europe. I'm not sure about Israel, in that young people seem to be moving towards the right. And if that happens here too, which it could do if the Labour government proves to be ineffective, continues to prove to be ineffective, then we could see British politics following a similar kind of trajectory to that in other countries, in which, as you know, questions like immigration, cultural issues become, and of course jobs, housing, all those practical things become dominant. And in that case, I think the Conservatives once again could probably establish themselves as the party of the majority, looking after the interests of most people, and seeing the Labour Party as an ideologically motivated fringe. In Mrs. Thatcher's time, the Labour Party became unpopular because it was seen as being the creature of the trade unions. Now I think the danger for Labour is it can be seen as the party of the woke elite.
I would like to ask you, Professor Toms, I would like to ask you the question which I didn't plan to ask, but regarding the Brexit.
Yes.
We are currently 8 years to the Brexit.
Yes.
Yes, it was June 2016, and now we are end of November 2024, more or less 8 years.
Yes.
Was that the right move for United Kingdom?
Yes, I think so. And the reason I hesitate, I think it was the right move. The reason I hesitate is that it's caused so much division and has been so badly handled that you might say, well, maybe it would have been better to stay. I think on the whole not. But for it to be successful, it needs a government that really believes that it was the right thing to do and is willing to take the opportunities that it offers. Of course, if Trump gets involved in a tariff war with the EU and Britain can avoid that, then it will prove Brexit was right. If, on the other hand, the tariff war includes Britain too, Trump will, which he certainly wouldn't want to do, would be pushing us back towards the EU. So I think it's still a bit too early to say. But the division in the country, which still to some extent persists, I think most people are fed up with the whole question and don't want to talk about it. But many people are determined to be anti-Brexit and continue to repeat the same arguments, which personally I think are demonstrably false, particularly the predictions of economic disaster. Well, there hasn't been an economic disaster. And if there is, it won't be to do with Brexit. But people keep repeating these things. Even the governor of the Bank of England is very anti-Brexit, has repeated them too. And it seems to me that it's not so much that they are pro-EU, because very few people you talk to know anything much about the EU. If you were to ask them how it works, they wouldn't know. If you were to ask them what our trade statistics are, they wouldn't know. But what I think they do not want is for Brexit to be seen as successful. Partly pride, because they were opposed to it, partly that they think Brexit stands for things that they think are bad, racism, a sort of nationalism, populism, all those things. So they simply do not want Brexit to succeed, and I think are determined to keep saying it's a failure and it must remain a failure. And I think that's rather distressing. It's not what I expected to happen. I thought people would accept it as a democratic choice, but at least a hardcore of people will not accept it.
But practically speaking, an average UK person, citizen, feels something different after the Brexit?
No, I don't think so. Some think they do. Some people do. If you have a small business that was selling, Christmas cards to Germany, you'll find it more difficult, more expensive. But most of our foreign trade is done by a small number of large companies. They don't find it any different. After all, they also trade with America and with Asia. It's not very unusual to find that you have to fill in a few forms. But I think some small businesses who were specialising in trade with the EU have found it more difficult. But the fact is there were very few of them. And it was costing us a huge amount of money to make it easier for them to trade. We were having to pay a very large budgetary contribution, which is far greater than the benefits that we got from the single market. So I think, you know, you can make a very rational case for saying that Brexit was the right thing to do and that it was successful. But for many people it's not a matter of rationality, it's a matter of sentiment and of identity. If you want to think of yourself as European, then you'll always be against Brexit. If you think of yourself as primarily as British, then you're quite likely to be in favour of it.
And people here in the United Kingdom consider themselves as British before they consider themselves Europeans?
Most do. There was an interesting opinion poll, an exit poll that was taken as people left the voting stations on the day of the referendum, and it asked how many people voted due to a strong ideological commitment to the EU, and I think the number was 9%. 9% of the Remain vote, which is to say 9% of 48%. So a small minority, but then that small minority tends to be very well represented in academia, in the media, and so on. So I think they have a much louder voice than their numbers justify.
What was the main reason people voted for the Brexit? I mean, the taking back the control?
Yes. I think immigration was certainly an important part of it. I mean, we've had unusually large and rapid immigration now since the beginning of the century, really. And although the orthodox view is to say that immigration is very good, and in some ways it is, at least not having it would not be good, but mass immigration year after year certainly causes social problems. It keeps wages low. It probably keeps productivity low, because if you can find cheap labour, why need to do things more efficiently? It does cause strain on houses. We have a huge housing shortage. And I think more and more people feel that this has been done. And of course there's the whole thing about cultural change, which the riots in the north of England a few weeks ago were in an inarticulate way expressing. So I think that people feel that this has gone wrong, and they also feel that it's been done without anyone being consulted. No one voted for this, and yet both the main parties have encouraged it, or at least have not seriously tried to stop it.
So you say that the Brexit is actually irreversible?
Well, I think in practice it will not be reversed explicitly. It could be neutralised quietly, in the sense that Britain would adopt EU standards, regulations, etc., without being a part. So we'd become a kind of satellite. I think the chances of that are, I mean, many people would like that, but I think there are major reasons for not doing it, essentially economic reasons. It would be very expensive, and it would attach us to an economic system that is certainly not very successful, to put it mildly.
Professor Robert Toms, thank you very much for this meeting, and professor from Cambridge University, St. John's College. And guys, stay tuned on Global Insights for more content like this. Like, subscribe, share. And Dr. Staetsky, thank you very much also for your valuable inputs.
The pleasure is mine.
And helping organizing this meeting, of course.
And the pleasure is mine too. It's been very good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.